This is an ODB Films production. Visit odbfilms.com today.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This show is all about growing in our understanding and practice of faith. Past episodes are available wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm Doug Tuke, the Vice President of Ministry Advancement at ODB Films, and today we look at Cabeza de Vaca, the conquistador who ended up blessing and healing people. I love this story. It was first brought to my attention a long time ago, and I have to tell you, I can't believe we didn't do a show on this before. I really can't. This is an unbelievable story. I mean, unbelievable. This show might take a little bit longer, but I just think it's really, really well worth it. So I want to dig right into it. If you don't know the story at all, buckle up, get ready to share this. If you do, tune in because there might be some details that you're missing. So what I found was a bunch of research basically covering his journals, so De Vaca's kind of write-up of his own story. And then there's a really bad movie that was made in 1990 that totally blows off all the cool Christian stuff that actually happened in the story. And they made him like a shaman and all this other garbage. That isn't true. Read the journals, read the actual history, the actual writing that comes from his hand. And I'm telling you, it's amazing. It's amazing. So, okay. So he was the grandson on his father's side of Pedro de Vera, the conqueror of the Canary Islands. And his mom's family name is the one that he used, Cabeza de Vaca. That's the name. Or it means head of cow or cow's head. And here's why that matters. This was kind of this illustrious name that was given to an ancestor of theirs that guided the Christian king of Navarre, Spain, and his army through a secret mountain pass, and they attacked and defeated the Moorish army. So he has this deep-seated, Christian roots, but there they are, right? So the entrance of the mountain pass was marked by the skull of a cow, and the king, in thanks of all that service, rendered the guide, gave his family name Cabeza de Vaca, or what we would say now, Cabeza de Vaca. So now, how does he get involved in this expedition? So Panfilo Narvaez is the expedition leader, and he secures from the King of Spain the right to conquer and to colonize all the land between Florida and the Rio de las Palmas in eastern Mexico. So there's an expedition of 600 soldiers and colonists, and they're sailing away in 5 ships from Spain in June of 1527. De Vaca was appointed the treasurer and the high sheriff of the expedition by the King of Spain. Okay, so the expedition fleet stopped for 45 days at the island of Santo Domingo to take on supplies. And get this, right away, more than 140 members of the expedition take off. They leave. They settle on that island. They're like, I'm done. Thanks for passage. We're staying here. All right. Whoops. And they don't come back. Okay. So the next stop was Cuba, where 2 of the 5 ships and 60 men were lost in a hurricane. So right away, this thing is just getting beat down. Okay. Narvaez buys extra ships, secures additional men and horses, but the size of the expedition was already down to 400 compared to the 600 that started it out. Now, upon leaving Cuba, the ships get caught in a huge storm that drove them toward Florida, and then this broken expedition rolls into Florida, into now what is Tampa Bay. Amazing to think about. Okay, so at this point, Narvaez is struggling, and his kind of shortcomings as a leader are becoming pretty crucial. So he wanted most of the men to disembark on the land, but one of the ships to be sent off was going to be sent off to search the coast for a harbor that they believed existed. Somehow there was a harbor there that they could land in. So De Vaca argues that the soldiers should not leave the ships until they were secure in some kind of known harbor. In other words, stay together, sail up and down the wilderness, up against the coastline, and then find a way where they can all land together. But that's not what happened. He didn't want to divide the parts. He thought we'll never find each other again. And despite De Vaca's arguing and others, Narvaez persisted with his plan. And eventually De Vaca agreed to the plan. I mean, he's like, all right, I guess I'm in this with you. So let's figure this out. 300 guys left the ships near Tampa Bay in 1528, and only 4 survived. Whoa, right? 8 years later, they end up, making it to Mexico and then, of course, returning to Spain. And that's the story that we're going to tell. But isn't that unbelievable? So before the separation of the expedition force, all the ships, there was tons of raids that were made into the surrounding countryside for food and supplies. So Tampa Bay was basically founded, and these parties of people, they made lots of contacts with the natives. Now, the natives of the area were not at first unfriendly, but soon they kind of made it known that they wanted the Spanish to bail, like, get out of town. We don't want you here. The native villages that all the Spanish encountered were really small. They were only like 10 to 15 huts constructed of woven mats. I mean, very, very simple. So since the range of exploration was limited, as long as the expedition, had to kind of stay within range of the ships, Narvaez comes up with this plan that the ships would sail along the coast, searching for safe harbor, and the foot soldiers and the cavalry would travel parallel to the coast and then eventually meet up with the ships. That's the plan, sort of like boats and people along the shore. Now, some of the officers of the expedition, they totally agree to the plan, but as mentioned before, De Vaca was kind of like, this is a bad idea. Nevertheless, De Vaca turned down the opportunity to stay with the ships. He said in his journals that duty and honor required that he join the rest of the force in the exploration on the land. So very quickly, we got problems. The force loses its bearings. They lose the ocean. You're talking about Florida jungle here, by the way. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. Small parties had to leave the main group and search for the ocean to make sure they were following. They have no compasses. And furthermore, the expedition was basically having to survive on the rations that they brought with them, since they couldn't find any food. They didn't know what to eat. Now, the natives were able to provide some food, primarily corn, but not nearly enough to sustain, 300 people. A group of 300, it doesn't seem that big by our standards, but this was way bigger than the population of some of these communities that the groups were even visiting, if you can imagine that. So some native communities were pretty friendly to the Spanish, but they were eager to have them move on. They're like, whoa, get out of here. We don't want you here. We gave you what we could. Now move on. And you can imagine what kind of behavior takes place when starvation happens. And we'll talk more about that later on. Now, other groups were just outright hostile, and they wanted to speed up the expedition's passage by ambushing the soldiers in areas where, like, fallen trees made it so that they couldn't counterattack and all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of stories about this. One is this. One of the hostile native tribes was the Appalachi, and this expedition entered the land of the Appalachian soon after crossing over the Suwannee River from the east, and there was a ton of corn available in the fields of the Appalachian. They farmed corn. So De Vaca led an advance troop of 50 guys and 9 cavalry to capture this town, to get their food. There was no fight for the town because the warriors had already left. Among the 40 small houses, there were only women and kids. But the men of Appalachian harassed the expedition by firing arrows at it from ambush. And shortly after the expedition's arrival in the town, the men showed up, the warriors basically showed up for the release of their women and children. The Spanish granted this, but they took hostage the chief of the town, and the warriors then returned to fight the Spanish. Then it was on, right? They picked a big fight. And this is a huge part of the changing of this journey, the expedition. So the Appalachian warriors, they crouched low and they moved about firing arrows with such force and accuracy, like in the seams of Spanish armor, like just brilliant attacks, right? De Vaca noted that these muskets and the crossbows that they had were totally ineffective in this fight because they couldn't see what they were shooting at. The cavalry were effective and terrifying to the natives in open ground, but unfortunately for the Spanish, most of the land was filled with trees and fallen trees and lakes, water everywhere, as you can imagine if you've ever been to Florida. And he writes about how in one encounter, the native warriors waited until the Spanish soldiers were crossing a shallow lake to start firing arrows. When the Spanish emerged from the lake to counterattack, the warriors just ran off into the woods. They got annihilated. So after resting and gathering the food stocks of the town of Appalachian, the expedition determined that the next town of significant size to the west was one called Aute, A-U-T-E, and it was known to have a lot of food, corn, beans, pumpkin, fish, all that other stuff. By this time, the expedition was less concerned about finding gold. They were done with that and way more concerned with food and survival. That's all that matters. You can imagine that when you've been out there for a while, this is what really matters. So they enter this town of Aute, no fight, no battle, probably because the inhabitants ran away. They heard about what was going on. And within a day or so, they bail. They're out. So a lot of the soldiers were sick and there were not enough horses left to carry them. The expedition reached the sea and set about building boats to carry them along the coast to New Spain, to this part of Mexico that was their destination. Now, this is amazing. They have some food, but not a ton. They don't want another fight. This construction of the boats, more like rafts, was really tough. They had no tools or any experience necessary to build these boats, but they improvised. They constructed these bellows for like a furnace from hollow wooden tubes and animal skins, and all metal objects that they had were melted down to make nails, if you can imagine. The shirts off the backs of the expedition members were taken to make sails. Unbelievable, right? The horses were killed and eaten. Their hides were used to make, among other things, containers for water for the voyage, and they named the location where they worked the Bay of Horses, which still exists today. So they constructed 5 boats. Each was loaded with like 50 guys, which was way more than they could safely carry, and soon they were short of food and water. So the horsehide water containers, they rotted, they lost their water supply, storms forced them to take shelter at waterless islands, and at one point, they went 5 days without any water to drink, De Vaca says, which obviously caused a ton of death. So some resorted to drinking seawater, and you know how that's going to go, right? So they encountered further storms. They met some natives who appeared to be friendly, and these natives took them to their village and gave them food, but later attacked them, because why wouldn't you? The expedition makes it back to their boats, and they disembarked after battles, which mainly involved throwing rocks. I mean, at this point, they had no weapons. This is insane, right? So they encountered other natives in canoes on the water who promised to get them water if they provided containers. So 2 members of the expedition were taken along with the natives to get water, and then 2 natives were left as hostages to ensure the return of the expedition members. You can imagine. They'd been burned so many times. This is the only way to do it, right? So the natives later came back without the water and without the expedition members. Not good. And hostages tried to escape but failed. So that didn't go well. Later, De Vaca says the natives returned asking for the hostages and then promised to return the 2 from the expedition. The Spanish wouldn't trust the natives. They were like, no way. So they kept the hostages. And then the expedition discovered that the seawater around them was fresh water. It was the outflow of the Mississippi River, and they were able to survive at that point on their own. It was just like a nasty, violent exchange. So the expedition tries to anchor in like a sheltered area, but a storm came up that sweeps them out to sea, and the storm eventually cast them up on the shore of an island, which is probably, we don't really know this, we assume it was probably Galveston Island. So they gave it the name Isle of Misfortune, and the natives actually give some assistance to De Vaca and the other survivors of this group. And when the group recovered a bit from their whole ordeal, they tried to leave the island. Their boat was buried in the sand, and they stripped off their clothes to better work in the surf to free the boat. The boat is launched, but a short distance from the shore, it's overturned by a wave, and a lot of people drown. And those that survived were totally naked, left with nothing, since all of the possessions, including their clothes, were in the boat. It just gets worse. So De Vaca's group is suffering severely from cold, hunger, and quite likely could not have survived on their own. Now, fortunately, the natives that helped them there, some that had helped them before, they came back, and De Vaca decided their only hope was to go to the village of the natives. This is pretty risky. Now, the natives agreed to take them, but some members of the group, they're totally freaking out because they thought when they were in the native village, the natives would sacrifice them to idols. De Vaca felt there was no choice but to take that risk. Like they're going to die. It's like die alone or die with the natives. So in the village, they were actually treated pretty kindly, and they recovered, and they soon realized that they're not going to be sacrificed. And after being saved by the natives for almost certain death from hunger and exposure, De Vaca's group of survivors were basically made slaves by the natives. So the survivors were divided among several native groups, and they were separated. They were decentralized. So De Vaca found there were survivors from other boats, altogether about 80 members of the original 600 that became 400 by the time they got to Florida. Think about that. All the ones that basically made it to the Isle of Misfortune. De Vaca endured about a year of slavery in which he was required to harvest a root among the shoals of the water. So usually the roots were gathered underwater from the shoals by the women of the tribe, and they made the slaves do this work. So this root was it was a staple food for the natives from October to the end of February. After February, the tribe would go to a place where there were oysters, and for 3 months they would live on oysters. Can you imagine? So at the end of April, The tribe would then move to a place where there were blackberries, and they lived on blackberries for a month. And during another 3 months of the year, the natives lived on the fruit of prickly pear cactus. And when the prickly pears became ripe, then the natives and the Spanish soldiers with them ate the prickly pears day and night. So another time of the year, the natives ate nuts, probably pecans. We don't really know, but that's kind of what we assume was available. And for 2 months a year when the nut tree produced, but that was only every other year. It wasn't always constantly, just amazing, right? The monotony was just amazing. So although the food that all the natives depended on was just like totally dram and monotonous, there was no choice. And often there was not enough. So Vaca, even during this time, he talks about going days without anything to eat. And he mentioned that it was not unusual for natives to go 5 days without eating. That was just kind of part of their way. And it occurred that there was nothing to eat. And the only place where food was sometimes was like 5 days away, a 5-day walk through difficult terrain to even get food. Those moments existed. So after more than a year as a slave, Vaca escaped from the natives on the Isle of Misfortune to live with another native tribe on the mainland. And in his new situation, Vaca engaged in trading among different native groups. So he's an outsider. He could carry out trade amongst tribal groups, which were bitter enemies, and they were usually at war, but he was able to traverse between them. So he would trade in sea snails, shells, hides, ochre, which is kind of a colored clay for face and body paint, and flint for arrowheads. And he was well known among the native groups in the area, and they kind of welcomed him for the opportunity to trade for the things that they needed. And he stayed another 5 years in the vicinity of the Isle of Misfortune, trying to convince other survivors to escape with him and attempt to reach New Spain, kind of regroup whoever was available. Now, during this period, imagine this, he's basically on his own, making a living trading between warring tribes, okay? Taking what he's learned so far on the expedition, which is just amazing to think about. Now, during this period, the natives encouraged some of the Spanish to become faith healers, like medicine men. So the native shamans engaged in faith healing. And when a native was ill or in pain, he or she would go to the tribal shaman who would cure the affliction by making prayers. Now, natives thought that the Spanish would be good faith healers because of their ability to speak in a foreign language, a language that they didn't know. Now, when the Spanish objected that these rituals would do no good, the natives replied that the Spanish were wrong and did not know what they were talking about. And Vaca talks about that exchange of language. So one of the survivors, Dorantes, was coerced into performing such faith healings, and he included those rituals of what he remembered from Catholic Church services from his childhood. And the natives declared that Dorantes and then later Vaca were highly effective medicine men. And the cured natives gave big gifts of food to the Spanish for their faith healing. So there is record of their use of the sign of the cross and simple prayers in these so-called faith healings, which is amazing. So despite the food given by the natives, the Spanish still found that they were starving much of the time. Now, moving among all these different tribes in the region, as a faith healer, Vaca basically heard what happened to the other boats and their survivors. So it's not good. The group without food, starved, and whenever one of them died, the others consumed his body. You've seen those films. And since the survivors were basically held by different tribes or groups, they were often separated all over the area, which Vaca is getting to know pretty well, right? So the survivors were only able to get together when their captors went to the same places to find food, such as the nuts or the prickly pear cactus, like we talked about before. So they plotted their escape to coincide with one of those times. And the opportunity arose, but was thwarted when the natives fought over a woman and separated, taking their captives with them. Bummer. The next year, at the time of the gathering of the tribes to eat prickly pears, the 4 survivors, Castillo, Dorantes, Estebanico, and Vaca, made their escape. The final 4, the remaining 4 survivors, complete of the original 600, here they are. And then they go. Now, other tribes welcomed them and aided them. They had heard of the faith healing of these strangers. Vaca had learned a number of different native languages during his 5 years as a trader. So their escape was aided also by the fact that it was the time of ripe prickly pears, so food was available. So they were able to kind of stock up and move on. So Vaca and Dorantes began to practice their faith healing among the natives that they encountered, and their reputation got monstrous across this area. the 4 became like celebrities in the region. This is amazing. So the tribes that sheltered them passed them on to the next tribe, taking the kind of valuable things like bows in payment. The tribes accepted this trade, knowing that they would get comparable valuables from the tribe they passed the 4 on to next. So it was really popular for them to say, wow, we received these great gifts from these guys. You'll receive these gifts also. Receive them well. So their reputation of Vaca was considerably enhanced in a story that he talks about where he treated a man that was thought to be dead, who subsequently was revived. Now, again, what are they doing? They're doing only what they know. They're not practicing native shamanism. They're practicing the faith that they know. This is where the film from 1990 just blows it. Like, there's like this bad historical revision that, they started to pretend to be shaman. What a joke. All they know spiritually is what they were raised with, which is like Our Father's, Hail Marys, Glory Bees, and the sign of the cross. Okay. 16th century Spanish conquistadors, right? Amazing, right? So the inhabitants of all these new villages become more and more generous. They're willing to give all that they possessed to basically please these men of great spiritual power. So Vaca, who was a soldier, let's not forget, was being transformed into this devoutly religious guy, almost like a saint. And Vaca relates the tale of the Malkasa, the evil thing. He talks about this in his journal. The natives said that about 15 years before, there had appeared a small bearded man possessing supernatural powers. And Vaca took the position that the evil thing was a demon. And he told the natives that the only thing that would protect them from the evil thing was an understanding and conversion to the Christianity that Vaca and Durantes and the other 2 knew. So it was thus that the 4 basically traveled through what is now Texas and northern Mexico, healing and introducing Christianity to the natives. And the 4 finally emerged from the wilderness at Culiacan in what is now the northwestern Mexican state of Sinaloa. After a period of recovery there, Vaca and the others traveled on to the city of Guadalajara, and from there to Mexico City. And many officials recognized that Vaca's experience would make him this extremely valuable person on any future expeditions into North America. So he knew several native languages. He understood the cultures. Vaca himself wanted to go back and bring the native tribes into the Spanish Empire and convert them to Christianity. And he says, by humane and enlightened means, specifically. This is a big deal. But Vaca claimed that if he were to carry out the spread of Christianity and Spanish civilization by these humane means, that it would only occur if he were the leader of the expedition. And the reason for that is because of his infighting with Narvaez before. He knew that if he couldn't pull all the strings, if he wasn't the one that was in charge, that his authority would be usurped, that the greed of gold would be awful, right? So he undertakes this perilous journey back to Spain to seek his appointment by the king to the leadership of another expedition, and no go. So unfortunately for Vaca and for the natives, the king had already appointed, here it comes, Fernando de Soto, to lead the next expedition. And De Soto asked Vaca to join his expedition, but Vaca said no way. De Soto was a soldier, he was an accomplished military leader, and he was not likely to give much credence to Vaca in his concern for humanness and fairness. And De Soto has his own story of genocide. Awful, right? So the king did appoint Vaca to leadership of an expedition, but not in North America. So there's a Spanish colony in the region of the Rio de Plata in South America, and it was in trouble. The governor was missing and feared dead. Vaca was to go down there and seek out the missing governor. And if the governor was dead, for him to take his place, which he did. He did do that. The other survivors stayed in Spain. They were like, I'm done. I'm not traveling anymore. Castillo and Durantes ended up kind of prospering, and Estebanico joined an expedition. They preceded the expedition of Coronado, and you know that story. And he ended up being killed by the native communities. Isn't that unbelievable? I just think this story is unbelievable. It took total destruction of these guys to rely wholeheartedly on the remnants of their ministry, on what they knew of Jesus, who helped them survive. What could have been by that leadership, by that means of conversion? Man, what a crazy story. Thanks for listening sincerely. Hey, we're partners in the journey of faith, even if it means being naked and starving. We are partners. I hope you'll share this Renovo podcast with friends info. Send your topic suggestions, questions, and or comments to doug@odbfilms.com. Always remember to engage the tradition and live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.